Hey guys, Kevin Govender from the Gut Health Gurus podcast. I've got a background in food science and also delving into the world of functional nutrition. And today I have a fascinating guest. His name is Sebastien Bureau. He's an author of a book called The Fermentation Revolution. And he's also got a wonderful company called Mannanova. Now, firstly, welcome to the show, Sebastien.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me today.
It's my absolute pleasure. And I just wanted to make sure, because your name is tricky, as most of the guests that come onto the podcast. So Sebastien Bureau, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's Sebastien Bureau, so it's French. It's all French. But Sebastien Bureau is pretty much how I go. Yeah, that's just right.
Cool. And one of the reasons why I wanted to get Sebastien onto the podcast is we were both involved in a fermentation summit pretty recently, and Sebastien was one of the early guys that I watched, and I thought he was absolutely hilarious. I was sitting there watching the video of him talking about kombucha, and your description of natto had me in absolute tears. I've never actually heard someone describe natto in such a sensual manner. And it was just so evocative the way you actually described it. So I said, I have to reach out to this guy and get him into the podcast because he's such a cool character.
Thanks. Yeah. I don't even remember what description I had. I always kind of like start flying when I talk about natto. It is very sensual, yeah.
It's slimy and gooey, and like I can definitely resonate with the sensual aspects. But what I like to do at the start of every show is just to set the scene for the audience. And the question I always ask is, who is Sebastien Bureau?
Wow, great question. Well, I like to, I always, it's funny because as time evolves, I always kind of jumped into fermentation. I'm just a guy who likes to go into all the stores and just like look at what I don't understand, go like, what the hell is this I'm holding, and ask the people around me, like, how am I supposed to eat this? And I always like to cook. I like to move and during the winter in Montreal, it gets really cold and there's not much to do like outside. Well, there's a lot of really cool stuff to do outside, but there's a lot of inside time. So my kind of creative space kind of became food, right? Food. So food fermentation and all that. Now, what's really interesting is, what I find really interesting, when you ask that question, who is Sebastien Bureau? I'm a food scientist. I have a background in molecular biology of plants and chemistry. My favorite thing is making mistakes. I love jumping into things that are scary and not dangerous, but like scary, and then failing like a dozen times and then finally getting it right. Right now I'm on a nice sourdough. I'm like on a sourdough adventure, basically just playing around with different types of sourdough and fermenting it in different ways and really getting to really understand the sourdough. And knowing very well that I'm not going to get anything even remotely satisfactory to me, for at least a couple months. But at the same time, like all my friends around me, I just give them all this bread, and they're just like, "This is amazing bread." I'm like, "Okay, perfect, that's great." But that's and I kind of like consider myself just a guy who just likes to who's completely unmanageable. So. One of my characteristics is that I'm completely unmanageable. So sorry to all my previous employers. And I eventually kind of just started my business, right? And I was just kind of like, the idea was, I'm just this guy who wants to do these things, but I can't really work for anyone. And I have all these ideas. So how about I just make a business out of it? And it's kind of like, I'm kind of just doing this thing. I guess I'm a businessman now. I have a businessman, but I'm a fermenter, and I do all these things. I really just consider myself like a guy who just likes to make food and has somehow figured out a way of making a living from it without working evenings or weekends.
Great. It sounds pretty amazing. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the two of us, because
exactly.
I'm also a food scientist. also, I would say, very, very creative, just like yourself. I would always, I would almost describe myself as being also pretty unmanageable, and say, hence headed out and started my own business as well called Nourish Me Organics, and
Right.
very, very similar to you, teaching people how to make fermented foods, and having the kits and courses. And so I can definitely resonate with where you're coming from. But just as you were talking about the sourdough side, I'm not sure, did you come across that news article recently with the guy that isolated some yeast from an old, was it
From an old like amphora or an old kind
yeah,
of bread basket. Yeah, I saw that
yeah,
real quick. I didn't read the article. But I definitely I looked over and I was like, okay, this is interesting. This is interesting. I mean, it kind of came off as a bit of a gimmick, but a lot of these things are gimmicks, right? It's all about the story. It's all
yeah,
about the story. Whether it makes an actual good product in the end is kind of irrelevant. But it's
yeah,
I mean, as much as we like to build our own stories with our products, and you can have a honey that's made by a small producer that'll taste exactly the same thing as a honey made from a large producer who's not organic and all these things, but we do attribute a lot more value to the artisanally produced one because of the process. And food is
mm,
very much akin to art, right? So
mm-hmm. I
so
hear you.
if you have a really interesting process and a really interesting history, it definitely contributes to the enjoyment of the product.
Yeah, I found the thinking process pretty interesting. Like, to isolate a yeast strain from an archaeological dig, essentially from thousands of years ago, and then actually making that into a product. Wow, it's like almost like stepping back in time to potentially what these people would have been consuming back then. It's like some form of connection to the past, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny. There's a brewery out in Quebec that also did the same thing. They went to an old brewery from 300 years ago, or the relics of an old brewery, and tried to get some yeast out of there. Found a couple dozen types of yeast, and then isolated the best one to make beer, and made a beer from it. And so it was a really nice story. What's really funny is that the techniques that are used are in no way techniques that would have been used back then. and
Mm,
so it's kind of funny in the way that we're using techniques to extract what it would do, but it could have been just as effective to just kind of throw some flour into the pot, take it out, and then make a sourdough with it. It could have given even something that was a little bit better. So
yeah,
I'm a
totally.
big fan. I'm a big fan of using the tools that you have. Just going like traditional, and not trying to impress anyone with fancy equipment. I'm like
Sure.
I'm like with your hands, with your nose and your hands. There's some really impressive stuff you can do, and in the end, it's ended up being a lot better than anything that would have been made in a lab.
Totally. And
Yeah.
totally. And there's another interesting study that came out recently with sourdough, and they were actually doing some metagenomic analysis of the sourdoughs as they were being made. And the conclusion of the study was a lot of the bacteria were actually, or the bacteria imparting the flavor, were actually forming part of that yeast species in the dough, were from the hands of the baker. So
Right.
that's pretty fascinating. So you've got some of the microbes coming from the actual flour, but then a large portion coming from the actual baker's hands, which is so interesting, because it's like the baker is imparting his own genome or microbes into the flour that then elicits the flavor and the texture and all these different elements of the sourdough.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In my classes, one of my favorite questions, like, we have a lot of, we give Mannanova has we have an online class, kombuchamasterclass.com. We have a lot of like person-to-person classes, and so I'll often spend an evening with 30 people just teaching them how to make kombucha or how to make sourdough and things like that. And one of the questions I get is, okay, well, what about sanitation? How do I clean? And I go, you know what? These are ancient techniques. The less you clean your hands, the better it'll taste.
Mm. Which makes a lot of sense. And
Yeah,
I
exactly.
and I recall it was literally like microbiology second year, when they actually get you to do the plate of your hand and then watch all the
Yeah.
microbes grow. And that's fascinating. And isn't it interesting how much the paradigm has shifted from being something that's like microbes being a dirty word and something that can potentially be harmful and kill you, to now microbes almost becoming like little heroes, which they are, but obviously there's some that are bad. But what modern science is starting to understand is most of them are actually good for us.
Yeah, exactly. Even the bad ones, if you have just a little bit, they'll help your immune system, right? It depends which one.
Totally.
Depends which one.
It depends
But
which
yeah,
one.
absolutely.
Totally.
It's always, I mean, that's always what it is, right? You get to know something, the first thing you realize is how dangerous it is. And then as you learn more and more, you go, okay, no, we can use this. Oh, actually, this is really useful. Actually, danger is like, the dangerous part of it is very much like it's much less relevant than we thought. But then again, it's a good reflex, right? It's like
Totally.
when I tell people, I've been mushroom picking for 10 years, they go, isn't it dangerous? I go, absolutely. The first thing you should do, that before you even learn any of the ones that are good, is learns the ones that are bad.
Yeah.
Once you've learned the ones that are bad, you can identify those really well, then go for the ones that are good.
Totally.
So it's a good reflex, but it's also, it's good that it evolves, right?
Totally. And I'm fascinated to dig in a little bit deeper with that mushroom conversation, because I've also recently developed this fascination for the fungi world and mushrooms. But before we do go down that rabbit hole, I just wanted to side note, we did an interview with a very interesting character, and people should go back and listen to that podcast episode with Dr. Jason Hawrelak. And what he was saying in the context of all these different microbes and, the good and the bad ones, there isn't really such a thing as good and bad. It's just humans putting our spin on microbes. But he was talking about this concept of an apex predator. So a lot of these microbes in the gut, for instance, blasto, which is a common parasite, is what we call an apex predator. So in an ecosystem, almost like a rainforest, these type of parasites and these other type of critters are actually helping keep things in balance. And it's the same thing with Candida. Candida is one that's very much, Candida albicans is the one that's bastardized a lot. But the Candida yeast actually digest a lot of heavy metals and break them down and help the body to get rid of it. So it's so interesting that even though there's some negative connotations with some of these bacteria, there is a purpose for them. Just the same thing with Helicobacter pylori or what's some other ones, some of the sulfur producing ones as well, Bilophila or desulfur vibrio, all of them in small levels are very important for the body. But when they become overgrown, that's when there's an issue, when there's too much of them.
Right, exactly. And they all kind of want to grow. They all kind of want their moment, right?
Yeah.
And we just consider them bad because we put that spin on it, or it's an opportunity. It can be opportunistic, but right, eliminating them is oftentimes worse than you're even worse off if you eliminate all of them. So
totally, there's often that kind of downstream impact when you take out the apex predator. Perhaps some of the other flora and fauna that were suppressed and under control then are allowed to become a bit more dominant in the ecosystem. So definitely the microbiome is a very young space, and we need to be mindful on the things that we're doing in that space and what sort of conclusions we're drawing from it. But it's very interesting, I thought. So guys, go back and listen to that episode with Dr. Jason Hawrelak to dig deeper. But isn't it interesting that this conversation was supposed to be mainly about kombucha, but we jumped down some pretty interesting rabbit holes already. And I did want to come back to mushroom picking and mushrooms as a general topic, because I think that's something that's piquing my interest, and I'd love to have a conversation. So tell us about your interest in mushrooms.
Right. Well, when I was realizing that I wasn't really a person that's made to work for people. First, I told myself, okay, I'm gonna get a domain, right, and then because that's what people do. I got a domain called mycohealth.net, right?
Myco, like
like myco, like mushroom,
mycos,
right?
and mushrooms, yeah.
The idea was, working with mushrooms and all the aspects of what mushrooms can do to help the environment, right? They're kind of like I guess the opposite of the apex predator, right? They're kind of like they're the lowest one down on the chain. They're the ones who have the most equipment to break down the things that compose our world, right? What's the only thing that can break apart plastic? Actually, no, bacteria too can do it too, but mushrooms are really good at it. They're really good at just kind of picking up the pieces. They're kind of like the bottom feeders of the micro environment of microorganisms. And I mean, my interest in mushrooms was early on when I started. I was starting fermentation. At some point I went, okay, I'm just going to become a fermentation guy. I'm just going to learn everything there is about fermentation. And one of the things was mushrooms, and mushrooms is really, really interesting. I mean, when you're talking about things that are kind of like, if you take a liquid, put it in a bottle, it becomes fizzy in a couple of days, you crack it open, you go, oh my God, I made bubbles. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, what's even more amazing is when you have like mushroom spores, and you can put them in some grain, and then 3 weeks later you have these giant flowers of like mushrooms growing all over the place that almost pop out overnight, and they're just kind of eating cardboard, and you go, it's really amazing, right? It's really magical. And so I read a lot about mushrooms as well. Paul Stamets has a few really good books. A few really good books about one is how mushrooms can help save the world, right? I think that's the book I devoured the quickest out of any book I've ever read. I just kind of went through it in probably about 16 hours. But I mean, for me, mushrooms is there's a few different things to it. One is rarity, right? I was always going in grocery stores looking for new flavors, while going into the forest and getting things that are even rarer is definitely really interesting. So, knowing that the only way you can get this flavor is if you go out into a forest in September after it's rained, and you go, this is the only way you're going to be able to get this type of mushroom because it doesn't last very long. But there's also the aspect of there's the culinary aspect, which is something that I find really interesting. But there's also the medicinal aspect, and we're really lucky in Quebec to have we have reishi. So we have reishi. It's called the Ganoderm des Pruches. So it's not exactly the reishi, but it's like in the family, and it has a lot of the same characteristics, and it's close enough. I mean, it's kind of indistinguishable from the Chinese one, and we have a lot of chaga as well.
Wow.
We have a lot of chaga. We have a lot of turkey tail. And so all these medicinal mushrooms are really great because they're a nice excuse to just go hang out in the forest. And then after that, and and on top of that, on top of them, and you can also see how healthy a forest is by the amount and type of mushrooms that it has. You walk into a forest that was cut 5 years ago, you're going to get a certain type of mushroom. You go around buildings that have just been built, you're going to get different types of mushrooms. And so it's a really interesting indicator of kind of what's happening in this environment. You go for some older forests that are near rivers that are well hydrated and that are kind of like older. You'll get some chanterelles, and so a really nice way of kind of just connecting with nature. And I'm a big fan, especially when we're making kombucha, of seasonality. So just being able to go out, pick what's the flavor of the week? Well, the strawberries just came out, or the chanterelles just came out, and so mushrooms, have been really interesting for me in the sense that it's something that's really fun and delicious to work with, and it's also the medicinal aspect. So being able to use chaga on a regular basis, just as an infusion for digestive or for any for it's very general health. And then being able to even take some of these mushrooms, go to the mushroom shop and exchange them for some other some mushrooms that can be more expensive. I've gone to the mushroom shop with a couple kilos of reishis and exchanged it for like a nice fresh truffle.
Oh wow!
And so it's been a really interesting, and it's also just a nice excuse to go to the forest, right?
That's
just
so
go out
cool.
in the forest and find forests and just walk around in them and have an excuse, and not just be aimless.
That's it. And in Australia, I think the mushroom season's around it's just coming into autumn. I think it starts when the rainfall starts to pick up. But I'd say around probably April this year was mushroom time. So we also went out with the family. I had no idea what I was doing. Literally just walked out with the family, and we were very cautious about what we were touching. we just kind of knew that white was bad. So if we saw any white mushrooms or there's death caps, so there's really bright red ones with the white spots, we just kind of stayed away from it. But we were just kind of just observing all the different species of mushrooms, and there were so many. It's after the rainfall, it's incredible. So I didn't actually pick any with the kids because we didn't know what we were doing. So we did exercise a lot of caution, but it was more just spending time in nature and trying to get a feeling for what is actually out there, which was quite fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for the first couple of years, I was picking mushrooms, but I wasn't eating them. Even like there's a couple I could identify, but it's really good to be more cautious than less. And so, in Europe, in France, for example, you can go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist is supposed to be trained to identify mushrooms.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I mean, at least that's how it used to be. And so you would go, you bring these mushrooms, you go, are these cool? And then the pharmacist would go, oh yeah, for sure. And you can do that here. There's some mushroom shops that you can do that. So it's a really nice habit.
That's awesome.
Also now there's Facebook groups and everything, and they'll help you out.
Yeah.
And because sometimes, it's maybe the second year and you don't know, but there's a really big patch of mushrooms. You go, man, maybe these are edible. You can pick them. And and there are no mushrooms that are so toxic that you'll get sick from just touching them. So, but yeah, just as a. Huh?
I was just going to say, there's apps now as well. I think there's one called iFungi or something like that.
Right. Yeah, there's some good apps as well.
Yeah.
It's always kind of hard, when you're in the forest, and it's kind of like you're either getting bitten or it's raining on you. And then I had a book, and the book just kept on breaking apart. But it's fun, you get the hang of it. You get to identify it. If you have kids, you can kind of, and so yeah, mushrooms have kind of really been in the health aspect, the food aspect, and just kind of the whole transformation aspect of it. The fact that you can, you can make solid blocks, basically, like mycelium bricks that can be used for various things that are kind of the same thing as styrofoam. I found that as an individual who was kind of looking for tools to transform my environment through fermentation, I found that mushrooms are a really interesting avenue for that. A really interesting avenue, especially since you can see them grow as well. It's the type of thing where you have a jar, and then you inoculate it, and then nothing happens. And a week later, there's a little white patch, and then that white patch grows and grows and grows, and you can see it, and you go, oh, that's some nice rhizomorph. That's gonna make some great mushrooms. And yeah, we do tempeh as well. Having worked with that, in a real world, or having worked with mushrooms in a real world aspect, we have a website called Fermentation Revolution. It's just Canadian, really, and we make our own tempeh starter. So, and I grow my own tempeh, and then I'll grow it on rice in a mason jar in a very sterile environment, make it sporulate, dry it, and just kind of like, I know the ropes of growing mushrooms, and fun because they're kind of, especially growing something like tempeh is, in the fermentation world, it's kind of like, instant gratification. It's like you're like at about 24 hours, it was grains, and now it's this solid white block, that you can, tell all your friends about, put on Instagram. It's definitely like a really satisfying type of fermentation as well. So
totally.
It's also these very delicate flavors, and it's just, I don't know, there's something about it. There's something about mold and mushrooms.
Totally. I'm all for the mold. There's a couple of side notes there that I'd like to underscore. I find the growing side, I've already recorded a podcast with a guy called Tony Shield from a company called Fresh Cap Mushrooms. And that's going to go down the whole rabbit hole of actually growing your own mushrooms at home, which is fascinating. The conversation we had was around, using plating techniques and agar and using spores and the PF tech kind of stuff. So we're going to go really deep in that rabbit hole, but that episode is coming up pretty soon. The other thing I find interesting is the whole, when you described the mushrooms being like, part of that ecosystem. And the way I've heard it described was like I think Stamets might have said this as well. They're like the information highway for that ecosystem. It's like the micro, like for instance, like mycorrhizal fungi in a really old forest. It spreads everywhere, and it connects the whole ecosystem together. And so it lends itself to keeping that whole ecosystem healthy. So there's a lot of parallels in that. and also in the ecosystem in our bodies, the actual impact of these molds and fungi and the production of enzymes and all that kind of stuff, which we can go down as well. So with tempeh making and koji as well, another one is koji, they're very rich, and natto, they're all rich in these enzymes, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, different ones have different enzymes, but they're really fun to work with, and they're definitely. I mean, there's definitely the whole internet of the forest, which is basically the mycelium. They say the biggest organism in the world is a mushroom. I think in the Bible Belt somewhere in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, there's definitely a lot of complexity to it. A lot of complexity to it. It's definitely something that's really interesting and something that's feared and unexplored as well, right? People always go, I'm not gonna eat mold. You go, okay, but if you eat a runny cheese, well, the mold is what made it runny, so maybe mold's not so bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely this. It's kind of like it's oftentimes overlooked because mold is associated with bad things. Generally, we encounter mold at home. Usually, it's not good, but there's a whole there's a whole side to fermentation which deals with mold, and it can be one of the most powerful tools for fermentation as well. For making enzymes, or for making antibiotics, or for making all sorts of different things. Actually, antibiotics, penicillin came from penicillium, which is a mold. So there's a ton of all of our best antibiotics are from molds.
Pretty much, or bacteria.
Or bacteria.
Essentially, the antibiotics we have to thank the microbe world again, the little heroes, for producing all these things that keep us well.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I find really interesting and you being a food scientist would understand this as well, is using these molds like koji and the tempeh molds as well to actually break down the proteins into some very interesting flavors. Because you think about a soybean, when you taste a soybean by itself, just boiled soybean is so bland and non-interesting. But then you add some koji to that, and then all those proteins get broken down into these small little amino acids and glutamate and all these type of things that lend itself to that meatiness, the umami, and that's fascinating as a tool. It's just so interesting. You can even take some. You can make Shio Koji. Are you making Shio Koji?
Shio Koji, is that with I'm really bad with the names, but I might be making that.
You probably are. It's like this. You make this really salty kind of koji rice, and you blend it with water, and you let that ferment for about a week, and you get this kind of like a rice slurry that's quite salty. But because you've allowed the molds to be activated, they start to chop down all the rice into smaller pieces, and then there's enzymes active, and then you can just smear that onto a piece of steak and leave that for a couple of hours, or even a chicken breast or something like that. And then you get all these really interesting umami notes coming out.
Right. Yeah. No. I've explored that a little bit, like the short koji fermentations. I actually even explored a little bit of those meat aging techniques as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they were successful or not, but there's definitely the first time I made them, I did not eat them. I put yeah. I mean, but yeah, there's definitely those enzymes. Yeah, we're used to all these purified enzymes, but that's where they come from. They come from mold, they come from amylase, they come from grains or molds or whatever,
mm-hmm.
and they're really powerful. You got to be careful with them, because they're gonna break down your steak. They're going to take your proteins and break them apart into these huge umami notes. And there's just a ton of stuff. I have some prosciuttos that are aging in my lab right now, and they've started growing a little bit of mold, and just a little bit of white mold. These like white crystals,
mm-hmm.
and I know they're gonna make it so like that white mold is gonna develop like a little bit of a cheesy flavor. It's gonna help make it more more tender. faster. But I mean, it's one of these things. It's one of these really long-term things where it's kind of like you just have this piece of meat and it's aging, and then 6 months into it, you go and there's like these fatty crystals. They're like icicles that like come down from like the meat face of your, and you know, like it's just kind of like, hello, I'm turning myself into deliciousness, you know. And yeah, I mean, I hadn't seen them. It's kind of a rare sight. Like you have to kind of have the same, but I hadn't seen it in a couple of years. But I just walked into it last week, and I was like, okay, these are gonna be really good. You
You
go,
get
yes,
the
and you kind of
sense.
touch it, you smell it, and oh yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of, I guess, the culinary aspect of food science, because I guess the two of us have been trained in all the science behind it, but then we still resonate so much to the creativity. And you look at these different molds and bacteria and techniques as like tools to create. So even though we're both probably quite analytic in our minds, being scientists, the creativity inside of me is bursting to come out and experiment with all these different palettes that I have, you know, with different bacteria or different yeasts or different techniques. That's what I
Exactly.
love. That's what I love about food and the science aspect of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm at my best when I basically, we have a, you know, one of our warehouses has a loading dock that's not used, and I went, when we got this place, I went, this is mine, and I turned it into my skunk works, which is basically my man cave, or like my garage,
Yeah.
but it's a lab, right? You know, I have my analytical tools, like I painted the floor, it's clean, it's nice, and I even put a little greenhouse in it. So for the greenhouse is kept at around 30 degrees Celsius and about 70% humidity. So all the fermentations that happen there, and I have just and and then, you know, I put some music on, wait till everyone's gone, and then that's where I'm at my best. That's where I just pump out. You know, you kind of get in this little buzz, and then you just start pumping out creative stuff. And once in a while, something bites, and you go, oh, okay, this works. This is perfect.
Mm.
And sometimes once in a while you get something, you tried it, you're not sure, and then a week later you taste it, and it just makes you want to rip your clothes off, and then you know you've got something good.
Exactly. And that's the
Yeah.
whole serendipity of it. You know, sometimes it's going to be terrible, and other times you're just going to nail something that's going to taste amazing. And then you've learned something so valuable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even if it's a mistake, I mean, actually, I'd say that all the coolest stuff I've done ended up just not. It was not at all what I was trying to do. It was a mistake. Like it went in a completely different direction. I went, oh man, I never would have done this, and it's amazing.
Do you have an example or something?
Um, you know, as I was saying that, I was like, he's gonna ask me for an example. Um, yeah, sure. I mean, of course, I have an example. Okay, let's just keep going, and it's gonna pop out.
It'll come out.
I sent it to my subconscious. He's gonna process it. He'll send it back in a couple minutes.
That's it. He'll come back when we're
Yeah.
in flow and in conversation. So how about we segue on? Because the main intention for me was to talk about the kombucha side. So let's go full circle. We went down the mushroom kingdom, very interesting path. Come back to the other mushroom. Kombucha is often called a mushroom as well. That's SCOBY. So how about we talk about what got you interested in kombucha?
What got me interested in kombucha? Well, you know, it kind of just happened at the right time, at the right place. I was studying molecular biology, and I was realizing it was a little bit I was feeling a little bit Machiavellic. I had like a little bit too much power. I felt like the technology was there for me to be able to do whatever I wanted, basically, but not safely. And I went, oh, I could do it, and just kind of hope it doesn't mess up. And I went, okay, no, Seb, don't do that. Go towards microbiology. Go towards fermentation. So I went towards that, and I was learning all these different fermentations, and then one of my old friends from high school, I think, yeah, we met in a park or something, and he had these big dreadlocks down to his butt, and he was like, oh yeah, you know, we started making this thing. It's called kombucha, and it was part of a business, a raw vegan business. This was 10 years ago, so it was, you know, it was out there, and they're like, yeah, we make kombucha. It's awesome. You know, it's cool. We don't really we could use some help. And I went, okay. So I jumped in, and then they're like, yeah, there was just these 200-liter vats of stuff that tasted amazing. It was probably pretty alcoholic. But it was like unstable, but there's so much stuff happening with this giant like pancakey thing. And I just fell in love. I just fell in love with that hedonistic part of it. You go, oh man, I don't know if I should be eating this. And you go, but I'm going to do it anyway. And just kind of jumping into that, and then being able to so I actually was working for free for like 2 months, just because I was like, how could you pay me for something that I love, right? Because I was doing other stuff. I was working real jobs, or like I was working jobs like in restaurants and stuff. Oh, and of course you don't need to pay me. Eventually, I was like, okay, I'm spending a lot of time here. Maybe you need to pay me a little bit. But yeah, basically, I fell into this place, it was just perfect. It was I was coming out of university with all of my training, like how to put things into boxes and squares and things like that, and turn them into straight lines and all these things. And then these people had this thing. There's like, well, we're making this drink. It tastes really good, but we don't know what's happening. We don't have any control. Can you help us? And so I just had kind of this blank slate, and it was basically like a head kitchen of a little restaurant place, a main kitchen, and they're like, okay, just do your thing. And I had already had a food microbiology lab in one of the rooms of my 2-bedroom apartment, to the dismay of my girlfriend at the time. Yeah, and so I slowly started moving my laboratory into that space, and it was great because I could just do whatever I wanted. Just kind of like, I was like, I don't know what this is. I'm gonna start applying all the tools that I've learned, and fail miserably time and time again at trying to figure it out. What's great about kombucha is even if you mess up, it still tastes good. So that's nice. I don't think I ever threw out a batch of kombucha. So I fell into it, and then yeah, and it was also part of a movement to kind of like, it's a type of person that's willing to kind of explore things that are unknown, that are a little bit weird, things that are made with tea, with traditional methods. And it was kind of this environment that was really interesting as well. So educating people. There was also the fact that we were, making kombucha, learning about it, but also teaching kombucha classes every week as well. And so you get this feedback of people, and people feel really empowered. And one of the most interesting things I found about kombucha, or is like a kombucha business, is that kombucha businesses, if you want to be a successful kombucha business, you got to teach people how to make kombucha, which is weird, right? Which is weird. But the thing is, it's because people don't know what kombucha is. And so the best way is to invite them in and just show them how you do it. And then give them a little SCOBY. They can make it at home, tell all their friends, and kind of this guerrilla marketing, and this very grassroots way of marketing, but also just kind of being a business. And how that is a huge clash with kind of the way food was going, or the way food had been for the past 50 years. Of like, no, don't do anything at home. You're just going to kill yourself. You're going to get sick. Like, you are not smart enough. You are not good enough to be able to make your own food safely. So let us do it for you. And so that culture of going, no, you can figure this out. Here's the easy rules of how to make things safely, and make something that's delicious. And you know what? Like, your kombucha is probably even going to be better than the one that we make, because you're going to have the time, and you're going to, yeah. And so there was that I really loved about it as well. I was doing a lot of tutoring in health and in math and science at the same time. So education is very much part of my background as well. I was doing like 25 hours a week with kids who were having difficulty and all that. And so that's when the company I was working for was very small. Back in the day, kombucha, no one knew what it was, and so it couldn't really be a big business. But yeah, so that's kind of what made me fall in love with kombucha. The fact that it's completely unknown, the fact that I could kind of just do what I want to it, to help kind of like stick it into a box and fail miserably, but also people had it still work. But also the fact that it's a type of business where it's very much empowering. and it's very much about you. And there's also the gut health aspect, right? This is, one of the central aspects of
Mm-hmm.
what we're talking about is you get these people coming in, they're going, oh, I used to have all these health issues, or I used to have this health issue. And of course, this is anecdotal, and a lot of the kombucha research is anecdotal, or a lot of the kombucha claims are anecdotal. But basically, you just get a ton of people going, I used to have IBS, but now I drink kombucha, and I have no symptoms, or and it can go on, and sometimes it gets dangerous, right? Because people go, oh, I have this terminal disease, or I'm very sick, and I've decided to not take my own medicine and go for kombucha. So, it's very, as responsible individuals, we went, no, you should still do traditional medicine. I mean, still do modern medicine, but, you can drink kombucha as well, and it's not going to hurt, and it tastes good, and all these things. But that having been said, that line between medicine and food is a line that has been written by kombucha for a really long time, right? Because it's made with tea, because you can put a lot of different botanicals in it that that have health benefits, but also because of just the fact that drinking kombucha makes you feel better. That's a fact. Right? Drinking kombucha makes you feel better. Like, does it make you feel better than drinking, like a flat soft drink, flat like commercial cola or something when you're sick? Who knows, right? But the reality is that kombucha is made by people with real plants, usually organic ingredients. It's all these things. All these things are kind of the perfect storm of good food.
Let's dig into it a little bit more, because a lot of people will be interested to know what, from your point of view as a scientist, that molecular biology background. Now, what are the things from a scientific perspective? And I get a lot of the studies are non-existent. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence in terms of the benefits of kombucha. But from your point of view, let's talk about the compounds in kombucha that could potentially be beneficial, and also from your experience, the microbes in kombucha that could be beneficial.
Right. Well, let's start. I'm very well versed in the kind of chemical components of it. So let's talk about that after. But I'd like to start with the microbiology of it, because it's kind of it's the hottest subject, and it's kind of like, it's always nebulous, and it's kind of like, and you know what? I think that kombucha, my opinion, I'm trying to figure out how I could say this without the possibility of getting sued. My opinion is that kombucha does have the same role as a probiotic. The microorganisms in kombucha will have the same role as a probiotic, so we'll have the effect of a probiotic, as probiotics are defined in their function. That having been said, the nature of kombucha, it being wild and artisanal, makes it so that there's a ton of different types of kombuchas in terms of what their composition are. Even though there's a central core, that is Comagotobacter or Acetobacter and Brettanomyces. So those are going to compose about 50% of your microorganisms generally. But basically, that together, all of these microorganisms that are happy, that are active, because kombucha is an active fermentation. It's not a finished fermentation. There's still stuff happening, and the fact that the quantity of them, and the fact that there's a whole consortium of them together, contribute to gut health. It will contribute to a ton of different things that are linked with probiotics. Of course, on a case-by-case basis, from the kombucha basis. And depending on how long you fermented for, it can have different effects on your body. But I think the microorganisms that are in kombucha do have, I'm going to say, huge health benefit. Now,
I'll pause you there for a sec before you go on. What's the optimal fermentation time for maximum probiotic in exclamation marks?
Well, it depends, right? I think a short fermentation is going to have a lot more. Well, not I think. I mean, I know a short fermentation. So let's say 7 days at a high temperature will have a lot more yeast in it. It'll have a lot more yeast. It will have kind of a lot more yeast in it. probably more alcohol. And so yeast, in my opinion, can be more associated with kind of like stimulating digestion. So you know, a short fermentation kombucha with higher sugar that's very happy, very yeasty, is something that's going to be gonna like kind of stimulate digestion a little bit more, going to kind of like speed up things if they need to be sped up. You know, it's the type that's going to have a higher amount of B vitamins like B12 and things like that. Um, uh, and in sheer like mass, kind of like in the amount of mass of microorganisms, like in terms of if you dried them, like that's going to have the most amount of microorganisms. Whereas if you ferment it for longer, say 30 days, it's going to resemble, or 30 or 45 days, it's going to resemble more of kind of like a vinegar. In which case you're going to have a lot less yeast, a lot more bacteria. I feel like the bacteria itself might have a bit less of an effect, kind of visual, like a more perceptible effect on health, but it might be able to do a lot of the same things as apple cider vinegar. But yeah, I guess it's mostly if you want to. Right. I mean, there is not much lactobacillus in kombucha as well. If there is lactobacillus, it's at the very, very beginning, and it's from your hands. And so that would be if you want a probiotic kombucha, don't wash your hands. Make a kombucha and ferment it for 24 hours. Basically, if you want lactobacillus in there, but you're not going to get any more than that. So that's a very short. But if you're going to do that, don't do that. If you're going to do that, just make water.
Yeah, exactly.
And so so actually as it goes down and it gets older, what you get is not so much something that's centered on the microorganisms. I think something that's centered a lot more on these fermented molecules, like these fermented like your sugar and your different chemical components that are produced during the fermentation. So that segues into the chemical aspect of it, but no, go ahead.
So just to summarize there, and we're pretty much coming up to time, but I think if you wouldn't mind, we've got a few little rabbit holes to dig in very quickly.
I got, the sun's still out, so we're good.
Beautiful. And so just to summarize, it seems like, according to what you're saying, that perhaps like a 7-day ferment with quite a yeasty brew could lend itself to better digestive benefits.
Well, from the microorganisms.
From the microorganisms.
So basically, yeah. So at a short fermentation, because we were just talking about the microorganisms, right? And so yeah, if you're looking for the microorganisms to really be super active, then a shorter fermentation is gonna have like at 7 days, you're probably at your peak in terms of numbers of microorganisms, especially yeast. And so yes, but in my opinion, I'd say most of the digestive aspects of the kombucha are linked more to the chemical aspect than the biological aspect of it.
Okay, so that'd be a good segue to jump onto the chemical aspects. But before we do, I do want to come back after that to commercial kombuchas versus home brews, because a lot of the home brews are shorter. The commercial ones tend to be longer, up to that kind of 30-day mark. But we'll park that and we'll come back to it. So how about we jump into the chemical side of kombucha and the benefits?
Right. So the most obvious chemical component in kombucha that's available and you can taste is the acetic acid. So the organic acids, mostly acetic and gluconic, but acetic is kind of the one that we're most familiar with. And that one is very much the same thing as apple cider vinegar. And so apple cider vinegar is known to help with digestion. It's known to help with ulcers. It's known to help with regulation of sugar a little bit, from the studies I've seen. And it's known to help with digestion. So that's very much a large part of what is easily quantifiable in kombucha as giving health benefits. Apart from that, there's also the plants that you put in there. So there's this process called deglycosolation, whereas a plant molecule that is not quite active yet becomes active through fermentation. So they'll take a glucose off of it and it becomes more bioavailable, which means you can absorb it. So in any given infusion of leaves or whatever, you'll have a certain percentage of of the molecules that are active and a certain percentage of the molecules that are not active. They're labeled for transport. They're made in one part of the plant and to be brought to another, or of the cell. Fermentation, especially kombucha fermentation, will make it so that instead of having 30% of the molecules that could be good for health or bioavailable, you're going to have 40, 50, 60, 70. And
Wow.
so that's why long fermentations are good, because as the fermentation goes on, more of these molecules get eaten up. So, for example, one of the most concrete examples is there are antioxidants, so catechins. So catechins, one of the most bioavailable forms of catechins is rutin, R-U-T-I-N. And so that is something that is produced and becomes more available, or that becomes more dominant as the fermentation goes.
Is that compound in the tea itself?
Yeah, exactly. So you'll have that rutin is there, but it's in another form. I don't remember the name, but it's in another form that's not bioavailable. And so if in your gut, in a healthy gut, you'll be able to digest some of it and make it bioavailable as well in your gut. But it's nice to have it kind of pre-chewed for you. It means you'll absorb more. So that's what the fermentation does.
Awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah, and basically a lot of plant molecules do that. If anyone who's made cannabis is legal in Canada now. So if anyone who's made a cannabis kombucha, if you ferment it for long enough, like, it gets pretty strong. You go, wow, I wasn't expecting this from this little amount of weed, but it does the trick. And so, but it's the same thing for any plant. Of course, it's when you're talking about science, you don't want to generalize, but this bioavailability is something that is seen throughout bioactive molecules. And so
absolutely.
So there's that.
Hemp kombucha is pretty hot down here. Cannabis is illegal in Australia, but we are permitted to add hemp oil, which is very popular in some kombucha ferments.
Right. Yeah, CBD oil. CBD oil is getting. It's actually, it's funny because in Canada we're not allowed to put CBD oil into kombucha yet. So
okay.
to each his own. Everyone has their own way.
And how about, is there any potential combinations that you'd recommend adding? For instance, a particular herb or a spice that could be more bioavailable after the fermentation?
Well, I saw some patents about it, and the examples used in patents were, I think, thyme. Thyme was one of them. What's another one? Well, I mean, tea is kind of like the most obvious one, and that's kind of what the kombucha fermentation is all about. But I mean, astragalus, ashwagandha, ginger, not so much, because ginger is pretty bioavailable already. But what else? I mean, I could go through some recipes. I mean, basically one of my favorite plants is called atiayo. It's from Haitian traditional medicine, Caribbean traditional medicine. Atiayo, it's the basil family, but it's kind of like the cure-all of Haitian traditional medicine. You put atiayo and it makes it taste delicious. What's really great about this deglycosylation is actually it makes it more volatile, which means that it also creates more aromas. So let's say you have a kombucha that's ready, you fermented it with just green tea or black tea, and then your rose bush outside is doing pretty good. So you just decide you're just going to throw a couple roses in there and let it sit overnight. You get this huge explosion of flavors and aromas overnight from this deglycosylation as well. It's a mix of that and the bubbles that kind of like just throw everything into your nose. But there's definitely I mean, the same thing goes for fruit as well. Fruit, if you put strawberries into your kombucha, that taste will die down within 2 days. So it's kind of the opposite. The kombucha eats all of the flavors. And so fruit has a tendency to not really get, the flavors don't really come out as much in fruit. They'll slowly die down. Whereas with herbs, they get better. Now, this week we made a kombucha with celery, and it tastes really good. We just made it, it's 2 days old, and I really hope the celery flavor lasts. So today we're like, do you think it's going to go like fruit or going to go like herbs? Is it going to get better over time or worse? So we'll see how it goes. You guys can tune in next time and I'll tell you how it went.
So how about some of those the spices? Could we use like pepper or turmeric or?
Yeah, actually, the turmeric pepper mix is one of my favorites. My dad wouldn't shut up about it for years. He's like, always just whenever you're using turmeric, just put black pepper in it. I went, okay. And then one day I made a kombucha with it. We did those with pineapple and a little bit of pineapple and some lemongrass. And it's just like bright yellow and amazing. And yeah, I feel like that's probably, I'd say if, like in terms of like, if you want a really strong combination, well, you take that, that Ayurvedic combination and then ferment it, and you're just, I mean, I'm sure if we sent it to the lab to look at the antioxidant content, it'd just be, off the charts.
I suspect so as well.
Yeah.
And I think the beauty of this conversation is it's just to encourage people to go out and experiment with different flavors. I mean, you've got this beautiful kombucha base that lends itself to making a lot of these medicinal herbs and spices more bioavailable. But aside from that, just have fun experimenting with different flavor combinations and fruit combinations and see what you can come up with. And then you might make your little magic elixir that you can share with your family.
Exactly. Making food, making good food that's healthy is one part of it, but feeling connected to your environment and, feeling connected to your garden and feeling, getting that satisfaction and that empowerment of making your own products and making them delicious. And I'd say that probably contributes to your health just as much as drinking the kombucha.
Agree. And the seasonality aspect of what's available and what's in your garden probably also helps as well.
Yeah, exactly. There's all these things in your garden. You never know. You live in the city. All you can grow on your balcony is rosemary and basil. That's great for kombucha. So, you're not going to eat lamb every day, but you can make a kombucha that's a rosemary kombucha that'll last you 3 months.
Exactly. So. And I'm feeling we probably need to do a round 2 at some point because we could go on for another hour, but we have to start to wrap now because I want to be mindful and respectful of your time. So how about we start to close and talk about the difference between, say, pros and cons of perhaps making something at home versus a store-bought product.
Okay. Well, so pros and cons. I mean, ideally it's both, right? Store-bought kombucha is great. Store-bought kombucha is eating up the traditional soft drinks market, which means that people, instead of drinking something that's made with extracts, caramel color, and 90 grams per liter of sugar, people are drinking a product that's made by artisans, that's low sugar, low or virtually absent of sugar, actually, in the Australian market. That's made with plants. And that's maybe local as well. And so all these things are kind of how I make peace with large businesses making kombucha, and they also make it accessible to the person who doesn't have time to drive to the other end of town and get it from a small artisan. They can just go to your local Woolworths.
Yeah, Woolworths or Coles or IGA.
That's it, or Coles. Yeah, or IGA. You can just go to your local store and just get whatever, and then that becomes a habit, and then you have that habit of good stuff, and then you can. It's just like beer. You can start off with something really, really normal, and then people get curious and go and explore the market. So it's healthy. Or people explore the market or make it themselves. So it's definitely something that's healthy. Commercial kombucha on the market is healthy. It's great, and it's nicely fermented. And the thing is, kombucha is touted as a health product, and so kombucha companies put a huge emphasis on health. Low sugar. Sometimes they'll add probiotics because people were drinking kombucha because it made them feel like they were taking probiotics, but then businesses couldn't claim to have probiotics because because of the way because they're not proven to have probiotics in them, which is fair, right? So they would add probiotics into it, which just makes a better product. On top of that, they want to make sure they have a good amount of antioxidants. They're just trying to make the healthiest possible product because that's what people want to buy. And so, and it's also controlled. It's non-alcoholic. It's non-alcoholic, and it's they're good products, and it's a nice entry. It's a nice entry into the world of kombucha. And if you want to stay there, then that's great. And if you want to go down the rabbit hole, then you can as well. Making kombucha at home, super empowering. Usually, people will go for a little bit higher sugar content. Right? They'll go it'll still be half of what you'll find in soft drinks, but you'll still have maybe twice as much as in a commercial kombucha, just because sweeter is easier tasting. It's easier to get it right. In terms of getting like a kombucha buzz, well, that kombucha buzz is very much alcohol linked, and Australia is really warm. So if you have a 4-liter jar and you're putting 7%, 8% sugar, and it's tasting really good and fizzy, sparkling in 4 days, well, probably you're at 2 to 3% alcohol, and so you get that little kombucha buzz, which makes you feel good, right? Alcohol is a medicine as well. I think, I don't know, I just said that, but I think it helps with delivery of stuff. But anyway, it helps with stress, and it's a social lubricant, and so there's that. And the fact that you can share it with your friends as well, like the best thing you can ever bring. I'm a beekeeper. Whenever I go anywhere, I bring honey, and it's the best thing you can ever bring is something you made, right? People, especially in today's world, like people don't really want you to, be a consumer and just bring some crap that you bought at the store that they're just going to throw out. But if you bring a really nice product that you made with things from your garden, then there's that. You can also put, there's also that restriction of, so, in that comparison versus of commercial kombucha versus homemade kombucha, you can put a lot more stuff in your kombucha. There's a cost restriction to commercial kombucha. It needs to work. You can't put, what's an example of something really expensive? Manuka honey in a kombucha that you'll sell on the shelves, because it's gonna cost. You're gonna be putting it like a dollar's worth of Manuka honey in each bottle, and which means that your bottle needs to end up costing like $7, $8, $9. I don't know. It just doesn't make sense. But at home, you can put Manuka honey you can put like a couple teaspoons of Manuka honey in your 4-liter jar of kombucha, and it's still going to cost you less than if you bought it at the store. And so you can use these super, super high quality ingredients that you'd never be able to find on the store. And you can also have this kombucha that's just kind of like really, really fizzy, and you can kind of just make it exactly the way you want it. And you can put 10 times more tea. You can put all the plants you want. You can make a kombucha that you'll like, but that no one else will like, because it's yours. Exactly. And so, from a health standpoint, I'd say I wouldn't generalize that store-bought kombucha is less healthy than homemade kombucha. I think, because it's always is this healthy for me? They go, well, it's got no sugar, but it's this and that, and this one has more sugar, but you made it with these herbs and blah blah blah. So it's really hard to say what's healthier and what's less healthy. But I'd say ideally, what you're doing is you're making kombucha once in a while, and connecting with it, and your friends are making kombucha. But if you're in the middle of nowhere and you want and you're in the middle of nowhere and you were just itching for some kombucha, because if you're making kombucha at home, and like you might be addicted, and that's okay, but you get a little craving, right? You start to get itchy. You just I just really want some kombucha, and it's okay to buy some, and it's going to be just as good. And so I feel like the market is evolving in a good way, where kombucha is staying healthy, kombucha is staying good. Even though some of the techniques might not be as artisanal as the ones that are at home. It's not just a jar with a SCOBY. Sometimes they're putting CO2 and sometimes they're blending in. There's all sorts of stuff that's happening, but it doesn't make the product any less good from a health standpoint. It just makes it less artisanal, and so it's more from a story standpoint. And so if you want a story standpoint kombucha, then you can go to the corner store that makes their own kombucha, and you can encourage them, encouraging the economy and all that. But from a health standpoint, I'd say, I'd even venture saying that, you know, some kombuchas are even more probiotic than your homemade kombucha because they put a ton of probiotics in them. And so I think those are the pros and the cons.
Sure,
And
that's a
so
great.
both are good. Yeah, both are good.
Both are good and great summary. And what I love is, and you mentioned it earlier, it's just giving people an option to move away from your soft drinks. And it's a great little gateway into the world of fermentation, because I would say kombucha is the one that's probably got the most mainstream adoption out of any fermented food that's probiotic based on the market at the moment. So it's a good entry to people to explore kombucha, and then they might explore things like sauerkraut, water kefir, milk kefir, tempeh, natto, all these miso, all these other beautiful fermented foods. And so, Sebastien, we'll start to wrap. If there was, and I always ask this question because it is the Gut Health Gurus podcast, and I want to give someone something actionable to take away from the conversation. So, if there's one thing that someone listening to this podcast could do for their gut health, what would it be?
Oh, for your gut health, don't eat transformed foods. I mean, eat as little transformed foods as possible. It seems complicated, right? But also, I mean, it's complicated because what's being offered to us is foods that are, you know, that are basically, you could choose them if you have no teeth, and you know, they're just made to basically just be instantly assimilatable by you. And so that means that you're feeding all of the most vicious microorganisms, and you're not kind of the most opportunistic microorganisms, and you're not giving a chance to the ones who are a little bit, you know, who are like really better at opening locks to eat their stuff. Well, you eat things that are less transformed. Eat things that are less transformed, you get a much better gut biodiversity. You absorb things more slowly, and you just, and then your gut rewards you for it. And so that's a single thing. Of course, you know, as a kombucha guy or as a fermented foods guy, I would say eat more fermented foods. And like, of course, like fermented foods are great. And actually, fermented foods don't count as transformed foods. They're non-transformed foods. But if you want to be realistic and score the most amount of points possible, then just stay away from transformed foods.
I'm so glad you said that, Sebastien, because as a scientist and as food scientists, the two of us have, I'd hazard a guess, have been to many hundreds of food manufacturing sites and being involved in many projects involved in, I think you mentioned transformed foods. I think in Australian terms, we would say processed foods or ultra processed foods, but I think we're pretty much on the same page.
Yeah. Processed foods is the same. I was using a calc from French, but yeah, say transformed foods in French, but yeah, processed foods.
Processed foods. And I'm so pleased you said that, because it seems so simple. Just stop eating.
Just don't eat crap.
Don't eat crap. Like processed foods, it's not that hard to make such a huge difference to your gut health and your health in general. So huge thank you for being on the same thinking as me, because that's exactly what I would have said. I would have said eat less processed foods, start to introduce
it's
more.
It's funny because we're food scientists, right? We know.
Yeah,
you know, like just don't eat that. It's not
that's it. It's not good for you. It's definitely not good for you. And I've felt crap for many years. And you wouldn't believe it, Sebastien. I was 14 kilos heavier than I am now. And you know, when you work in industry, because you get access to all these samples, like all the samples, and you have like your little, they have like these like almost a store in the factories where you can go and buy all the product for like a staff discount.
Right.
And it was all of that. So I was like, I lived off processed foods because I was in that industry, and I felt miserable. I looked miserable. It was just a terrible time in my life. So 100% agree. So someone listening to this podcast, you have totally blown their mind away. They're super engaged with what you have to say. They want to work with you. They want to read your books. They want to get in touch with you. How can people find you, and how can they access your books?
The books are on Amazon. So we have French, English, and Italian. And my website is mannanova.com. So MANNANOVA. You can look at the link.
I'll link it. Yeah, I'll link it. Yeah,
Yes.
I'll put a
And
link in the show notes.
thanks. And yeah, if you want to learn about, if you want to learn everything I know about kombucha, we just launched the Kombucha Masterclass. So it's it's many dozens of hours of videos where it's basically a class that I give that I perfected over the years, in my opinion. And there's that. So that's kombuchamasterclass.com. And apart from that, I hang out at the brewery called Ma Brasserie, which means my brewery, a cooperative in Montreal. So if you just walk in, we always have a couple kombuchas on tap, and you can ask for me, and who knows, I might show up.
That's awesome, man. Sebastien, that was such a fun conversation. I really enjoyed chewing the fat on the science with you and getting a deeper understanding from someone that's an expert in the world of kombucha. So huge amount of gratitude, Sebastien, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It was a ton of fun, and yeah, if you were interested in following up with this, it would be my pleasure.
And we must do a round two because there's so much more to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. Awesome, man. Thanks, Sebastien.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks.